This is The Balance Dilemma. We tackle the often uniquely, but not always, female dilemma, managing life, work, family, and self. I'm Maura Carlin.
And I'm Christy Derrico. At The Balance Dilemma, we speak with women and men to hear their balanced stories. Our guests are entrepreneurs, reinventors, creators, executives, parents, and partners, telling us what we really want to know. How the heck did they manage that? And can you have it all and all at the same time?
Our guest is New York Times bestselling author Fiona Davis. You know her for her many historical fiction novels set in New York City, including The Address, The Spectacular, The Masterpiece, and The Lions of Fifth Avenue, which was a Good Morning America book club pick. Her latest is The Stolen Queen, and Fiona's going to tell us all about it, including the process and her inspiration. But Fiona also has her own story, a series of career pivots and a recent diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. Welcome to The Balance Dilemma, Fiona.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, for me, this is particularly exciting because I knew Fiona in what I'll call our prior lives. When someone recommended one of her books and I saw her name, I knew it was familiar. And then when I saw the picture, it was clear we had worked together at a law firm. So as I recall, Fiona, at the time, you were an actress and paralegal going on to graduate school at Columbia?
Yeah,
did I get that right?
Close. I was an actress for about 10 years in my 20s. And whenever I didn't have a job, I would come back to the law firm and work as a legal secretary. And so they just moved me around wherever they needed me. And it was a great job because I could run out to auditions on my lunch hour if I had to. It was just a dynamic, fun place to work.
Agreed.
And then, yes, after that, I went to Columbia Journalism School.
So tell us about that pivot.
Yeah. So I came to New York and I did Broadway and off-Broadway and regional theater and all that kind of fun thing. And it was terrific. But right around my late 20s, I realized that my friends who were women who were actresses, who were a little older, were having a really hard time finding work. And this was in the 90s. So it was a different time. And then all my guy friends who were acting were getting all these great character and dad roles and working consistently. And I thought, okay, that might be a problem. And so I didn't know what to do next. And back then, you couldn't Google, okay, what's an alternate career?
And law didn't interest you?
No. What it is watching what lawyers went through, and what's so interesting is so many lawyers make really great fiction writers.
Yes.
Because they understand logic, they understand plot. What you do is so similar.
It's
so I have a ton of friends who are lawyers who now write books. So there you go. But I didn't know what to do next. And so NYU had a career counseling thing where you could go and get a Myers-Briggs test. And it told you what your personality was and what careers matched. And so I took that and it told me that I should be either a journalist or a cop.
Okay.
So
that's
easy.
Interesting. That was an easy choice.
And so then I applied to Columbia Journalism School and got in, thank goodness, because it's the only one I applied to. And then that's where writing really became the focus. Before then, I had not written. I could not imagine writing a book. It was not something I considered.
And tell us about your journalism career.
Yeah, I loved going to Columbia. It was a really fast, hard program. You were working constantly. I just met some incredible people and had some great professors there. And after that, I worked at a television show for the arts, which was interesting. But TV wasn't for me. I'm not a good multitasker. I can't do 4 things at once. And that's what you have to do if you're in TV production. And so then I worked for a theater magazine and then went freelance and started writing articles on health and fitness and that kind of thing. And I did that for quite a while.
And then where did historical fiction come in?
So then I got divorced. And at that point, I had this idea for a book that came out of an article that was unwritable. It centered around the Barbizon Hotel for Women, which had turned condo.
Right.
And went condo in around 2005. There were a dozen of the old-time residents still living there. And they basically built these luxury condos around them and moved them all to the 4th floor. And I thought, you know, what's it like when one of these women who are in their 80s and 90s, who lived there in its heyday, right? When Grace Kelly and Joan Didion lived there. What happens when they meet the guy who just bought the $17 million penthouse, right? Because, you know, they own the place.
Right.
And I thought it would make a really good article. But they were very private at that time and didn't want to be interviewed. And I couldn't shake it. And I started thinking, well, maybe I'll try writing this into a book because I'd like to read that book. And that's where I started kind of fiction and nonfiction are so different. Journalism is a completely different ballgame from fiction, where you get to make stuff up, which is really nice. And so I kind of worked on that, didn't tell anyone I was going to write a book, just did it quietly. And luckily found an agent and suddenly was off in a whole new direction. I always say I recommend changing your career every 10 years because in the end you land where you should.
And that was The Dollhouse, wasn't it?
Exactly.
Right.
And
right.
you really stepped into a genre that was pretty much emerging. I think of it as, it is historical fiction, but it's also women's fiction, because there's several of you out there that we love in our book club, and Marie Benedict, and you know, we've read a lot of these books, and they're just topics we want to read about. Just having you describe the Dollhouse plot, I want to pick up that book.
Yeah, you know, and that's what's interesting is that group, the Marie Benedict, Kate Quinn, we all know each other, and it's so supportive. It's women who just want to help other women. And so if I have a question, I can reach out to any one of them and say, all right, how do you handle this? Or how do you handle that? And our books are all about finding these women who may have been lost to history and bringing them to the forefront and giving them a voice.
Love it.
Love it. So before we go into your books, tell us about, you know, some of the life choices. You know, you mentioned that you made a decision not to have children. Tell us about that. Was that a change and unexpected?
Yeah, well, you know, when I was married, I had stepchildren, and that was a delight. They were 4 and 8 when I met them. It was so much fun. And so I feel like I vicariously, you know,
well, you were a parent.
Yeah, you know, not completely. It's not the same. Absolutely not the same. But, you know, making orthodontist appointments and doing homework and getting them to bed and that kind of thing. And I understood very clearly how hard it is and how it's a slog sometimes. And sometimes it's a complete delight. But I knew that I didn't have the patience to have a full-time child. That wouldn't work for me. And I have nieces who I adore, and I have friends who have kids, and watching them grow up has been a joy, but I've never had that urge.
Okay.
Your characters have.
They have. Some haven't.
Right.
You know, and some are conflicted. Yeah.
And I love that you address balance issues, which is what we discuss here. It's refreshing to read it, and it comes off so authentically to hear a character struggling with the things that we talk about here.
Absolutely. Now, you've also had another, I don't want to call it a pivot, a twist when you were diagnosed recently with Parkinson's. Tell us about that and how you got involved in Michael J. Fox's foundation.
Yeah, which is, it's a great foundation. So in 2020, we were all in lockdown, and my right hand would shake when I held my phone. And I just thought, oh, I have a big book coming out, you know, it's just nerves. But I eventually made an appointment to go see a doctor about it. And I remember it was August of 2020, and I got a call from my agent and my editor, and they said that my book, The Lions of Fifth Avenue, had hit the New York Times bestseller list. Amazing. And it was just the best day. We celebrated with champagne. It's every author's dream. You know, it was fantastic. The very next day, I had this doctor's appointment. And I remember going to it, and he looked at me and had me do all these tests and things. And then he said, oh, yeah, that's Parkinson's. And I thought, that can't possibly, you know, I thought it was essential tremor. There's all these other things it could have been.
Right.
But it was. And it was quite a shock. And it took a long time for me to understand that Parkinson strikes people in very different ways. And what I have at the age of 53 back then is not what an 80-year-old has. And so I need to be very selective as to who I talk to and how I learn and research about it, because I basically went into journalist mode. And I met some women who were my age or a little older who had Parkinson's, and suddenly, you know, I had this amazing resource and this support group of other women who understood exactly what I was going through and gave me such hope, because they were all doing so well. It was really inspiring. But in terms of balance, it's very interesting because Parkinson's, the one thing that's known to either kind of stop the progression or even possibly slow it down, some studies have shown, is hard exercise. So I was like, woohoo, that's just great. You know, and I'd always worked out, but with Parkinson's, you have to make the time to work out. You need to work out 5 times a week for 30 minutes and get your heart rate up to 80 to 85%. It's really specific. And that's hard. That's working, that's biking hard, that's swimming, that's running. And so if I do that, and you know, even today I had barely a window between interviews, and I ran down to the gym in our building here in New York, did a half-hour bike, ran up, jumped in the shower, and got ready for this. Because at any other time I would have said, oh, there's no time. But when that's the one thing that they've proved can help, there's just no question. You have to make time for it. You have to balance your life. You have to sleep well, you have to eat well, and you have to exercise. And so that was kind of like a real quick start for me. It's like a reboot of, all right, what's a healthy life? How do I balance that and work, which was ramping up as more people wanted me to talk and travel and still write a book. And so it's interesting because I think a lot of people have a balance dilemma when their children are young and they're trying to get their careers going. And I seem to have struck it later between managing Parkinson's and managing my career. But, you know, the Michael J. Fox Foundation is terrific, and they've been so welcoming, and there's so many strides being made in terms of research and development that, you know, every day I walk down my street and I think, okay, look at you, you're walking, you're doing fine, you know, you're doing well. So enjoy this moment because we don't know what's ahead. And I also feel like I could worry about this like crazy, you know, and spend every minute of every day angsting about it. And then what if in 7 years they come up with something that cures it or slows it or stops the progression? And I've wasted all that time.
Right.
And so I'm very much into being positive, getting out there and keeping myself busy.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's important for people to hear that type of hopeful message.
Absolutely.
But I have a burning question that's looking me right in the face. I want to hear about this new book, The Stolen Queen. How did you come up with the idea? How does that work?
Thank you for asking about that. Yeah, so each book is set in an iconic New York City building, like you mentioned. And the Met came about in a really strange way. I read this article in the New York Times that talked about the Met Gala in 2018 when Kim Kardashian showed up. She was wearing this gold sparkly dress, and she posed next to this gold sparkly sarcophagus that the Met had just bought the year before for $4 million. And it was this very iconic photo, and it went on social media, it went viral. And the guy who stole that sarcophagus and smuggled it out of the country saw the photo and complained to an undercover informant that he'd never been paid. And that tipped off the Manhattan DA's office that has a whole section for stolen art.
Yes.
And they looked into it and found that the papers had been forged, and eventually the Met had to return it.
Wow.
And I thought, interesting mix of pop culture and ancient art.
Right.
Just,
And the pop culture, I have to ask, was that the year that Kim Kardashian wore Marilyn Monroe's dress? Was that the dress?
I don't think so, because this was really, really gold. And the Marilyn Monroe's was more a silver, right? Yeah, so I think
That's
that was
probably
more.
right. Okay, I just had to ask.
You know,
Christy.
everything comes back to the Kardashians. Look at that. But that's really interesting. Now, when you have an idea like this, all right, you're many books past being a debut author, but how does it work? Do you reach out to your agent and, you know, spitball and say, what do you think? Is this a good one?
I do. I let them know what building I'm considering, and I get their approval. But that's really all I have to do. Then they just let me run with it, which is really fun. And I do about 3 or 4 months of intense research where I'm interviewing people who work at the Met, people who work at the Met Gala, figuring out what time period to set it in, learning about ancient Egypt, learning about archaeology, going to Egypt, spending 2 weeks there, you know, taking in everything I could about the country. It was such a fun time. And eventually the story just starts to bubble up and characters start to bubble up.
And you had to find characters in 2 different time settings. Was there truth in those characters, or were those created by you?
The curator, Charlotte, who's a curator at the Egyptian wing and gets caught up in this hunt for this stolen artifact. She is based on a woman named Christiane Noblecourt, who was a very important archaeologist, worked in the 1930s, worked throughout the 1900s actually, and helped save some of the temples from being swamped by the Aswan Dam. You know, she saved artifacts in World War II from being taken by the Nazis from the Louvre. She was incredible. And I thought, here's this great woman. So my character is inspired by her. It's not exactly her life. And in my author's note, I always make very clear what is fact and what's fiction, because I know especially historical fiction readers want to know.
Well, that's also another common theme in your books. You have these outstanding women, and I love that they are inspired by real women, because sometimes when you're reading something historical and they insert a character that we wished was there and it's not really, you know, native to the material, it's kind of disheartening. But that's amazing that you found a woman that really existed in time and did wonderful things, and you're bringing light to her now.
And you always... Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Fiona. It's okay.
I was going to say there's a wonderful book about her by Lynn Olson called Empress of the Nile. And from there I got details like if you slept in a tent on a cot, and you would put cups of water under the legs of your cot so the scorpions couldn't crawl up. And it's that kind of detail that you want to find and put in the book, because it anchors the reader in the location and the time.
It absolutely does. And another thing that you put into the books, because I did read it, was, and it's in many of your books, it's what the women of that, whatever the era was, were facing. I mean, Charlotte faced real discrimination based on her gender. And you seem to get that in those books also. How do you go back and find what was really going on at the time?
You can always find documentation, biographies, that kind of thing. For my book set at the New York Public Library, there's a character, Laura, who goes back to the Columbia Journalism School, but in the 1910s when it was just opened. And I found a history of the school, and it mentioned that women and men were on a completely different tracks. The men got to cover politics and murder. The women covered orphanages. And the discrimination back then was pretty severe. Of course, it's not like that at all anymore. Women, in fact, are the majority of the student body. But I can usually find something like that, and if it surprises me, I know it'll surprise and shock the reader.
I have a question since you've brought this up. And I did read through your afterword to The Lions of Fifth Avenue, but you do have a little plot line about major discrimination against the female students. Was there any basis in reality in what you had in the book?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Again, there's some great history about the school. And it was just the way it was. It wasn't just the J school. It was everyone. It was rampant. Yeah. And I think that's why a lot of us write these books, to show how far we've come and then how far we still have to go. For example, in the 70s, when The Stolen Queen is set, women until the mid-70s couldn't get a credit card on their own. They couldn't get a mortgage.
74.
They couldn't have a bank account. I mean...
Right, that was 1974.
For modern times.
That's absolutely.
Yeah, and plagiarism of women's material, you also had that, and that's a known...
That's made up. I mean, to be honest, that bit I threw in there. No, I had no professor try and plagiarize anything I wrote. They were very, very honorable. The ethics at Columbia are taken very seriously. But yeah, the thing with characters is you create characters, you create a story, and no one wants to read about a happy family that gets happier, right? That's not a story. So you need to throw obstacles in their way. And that's where things like the plagiarism part comes in.
Right. And just generally speaking, there's major authors that we speculate it was the wife who may have written the material. But you did a great job. I loved the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
What is it next? I know you're working on your next book. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah. The next one will be set at the Morris Jumel Mansion.
Okay, tell us about that.
No one knows about it.
No.
No one knows. Even New Yorkers who've lived here for years don't know it. It's this hidden gem. It's a beautiful mansion. It's enormous, up on 161st Street. It's got a gorgeous garden around it, and it's the oldest house in New York.
Who lived there?
There's things, it's such a great history. It was built before the Revolutionary War, and George Washington headquartered there for a while. But the woman who lived there in the 1800s, Eliza Jumel, was the daughter of a prostitute in Rhode Island who went on to become the richest woman in America. And she lived in the mansion. She died in the mansion. Her ghost is still there, apparently. And she married Aaron Burr, was her second husband, from Hamilton, as we all know.
From Hamilton, yes.
And in fact, Lin-Manuel Miranda spent some time in his bedroom as he was writing to kind of channel his energy.
That's so interesting.
Right. I actually do know that. It's up by City College. Yes.
And it's a beautiful building, and it's a museum now, and they could use some love. And I just thought by writing a book about it, maybe we can get people to venture uptown.
Oh, we need a party there. I love it. A glass of champagne. It sounds great.
So buildings are characters in your books. How do you go about picking all of them? I mean, really, every one is centered around a building, which is such an interesting idea, not done by other historical fiction writers. What made you do that?
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into it. It was very organic after writing the book set at the Barbizon. I remember walking down the Upper West Side and seeing the Dakota and just thinking, God, I'd love to get inside there. And eventually getting inside and learning all about its history. And what I do is I find a building and then I do all this research. And I look for the surprises. So, for example, the New York Public Library. I found this article that talked about this 7-room apartment that was built in the library when it was built, that was for the superintendent and his family to live in. And that the superintendent lived there for 30 years. His daughter was born in the library.
Wow.
The kids used to raise pigeons on the roof. And from there, I just think, okay, a family living in a library, that's a book.
Right.
And with every one, I found something like Grand Central Terminal.
I love that. I have to tell you, the idea, I mean, no one knew that there was an art school in Grand Central Terminal.
Yeah, co-founded by John Singer Sargent, there for, I think, 20 years, had 900 students. No one knew. And that's what I look for, because I think people think they know these landmarks, and then you find this little secret and you want to tell the world.
Well, and the city's always evolving. There's so many things that we know in one way that was different in another time, like the Barbizon, and that's what makes it great. So are we going to see any of these books of yours in film? I mean, anything in the works?
I love that idea. Yeah, there's been some interest. We'll see what happens. I think especially historical fiction with Bridgerton and the Queen's Gambit. There's so many wonderful programs that I think people are hungry to see them. So hopefully, I think it'd be great. I'd be up for it.
We're a great audience. Women rewatch things. They love things.
I mean, and we're readers.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, and Pride and Prejudice. I mean, there's so much out there that shows there's an appetite.
So I have a question for you, which is along the lines of something we ask many of our guests. You come out in these books as an authority. Do you ever have a feeling of imposter syndrome when you're out there promoting and having these great novels of yours?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I remember when I had to do my first author talk. It was at a library in Connecticut, and I was so nervous. My knees were shaking. I just, what were people going to ask, and how do you talk in front of people? I was always very shy, and I was just, I thought this is going to be the most traumatic thing ever. And then I realized readers are the warmest people ever. If they've read the book and loved it, that's why they've showed up. And that the questions were fun, because in this book, I am the expert. And that's what I had to remind myself, that I wrote this book, so I'm the expert on it. So it's okay. I know the answers. And I think having always been a kind of a straight A student who had to please everybody and do the right thing, and it was very freeing to think, okay, this is mine. And then I started having fun. And in terms of balance, now I'm often asked to fly somewhere and do a talk or a luncheon. And I love doing it because I get to meet readers. Often people come up to me and say that they have Parkinson's and they haven't told anyone, or their husband has it. So there's a wonderful give and take there about kind of more deeper subjects. And so now I have to balance the introvert part of me that wants to stay home and write a book, and the extrovert part that loves to go out and meet readers. And making sure I leave time to write is very important. And I'm still working on that and trying to get that right.
Oh, that's something we want to know about. Tell us about your process. Like, what does a day look like when you're in writer mode?
Yeah, I try and get the writing done early. I usually write about 1,000 words a day if I'm writing that first draft. And that for me is the hardest, to work with a blank page and just get something down. And that's what I do. I get something down knowing that I will be able to go back and play with it later. And once that's done, I do about 10 revisions of going back, layering in more, sending it to my agent, getting it to my editor, taking in comments and deepening the characters as much as I can. And the whole process from beginning to end is about 1.5 years, which is pretty quick, but then I mentioned that I don't have kids.
And you mentioned bubbling through of ideas, but are you a pantser or are you a plotter? How does it work with the outline of the idea?
Well, my dad is an engineer and so is my brother, so I am such a plotter. I figure out the characters, I figure out what they want, I figure out the story, and then I very carefully lay out the plot. And if there's 2 timelines and a mystery, they have to work together very carefully. And those days, the weeks that I'm braiding the 2 together, I'm usually drinking a lot of wine at night because it's just so hard to make one timeline work without giving away too much on the other. I like books that you want to fly through them and, that have a plot and keep the tension going. And to do that takes some work in the beginning so that the plot is solid and there's no holes, and then I can be free to write it.
So does that make it easier to avoid imposter syndrome or blank page syndrome because you've outlined it essentially?
Yeah, I think it does. It gives me a roadmap. And I know if I'm stuck, you know what I find every time, about 75% of the way through the first draft, I just want to throw it out the window. I'm too close to it. I just cannot imagine anyone would want to read this. And I remember hearing Laura Linney talk about her acting career. And when she's doing theater, right before Tech Week, she just is done. She can't imagine it's going to work. And she knows if she pushes through, she'll have a performance. And it's the same thing. Any kind of creative thing you're working on, you hit that roadblock. But if you push through and get to the end, then you have something to mold and to play with. And I think that's my advice to anyone trying out something new, is to just get to the end. And then you can see the big picture and see if it's worth it or not.
Christy, I'm sure you have more.
Christy is... Here, I love research, and I am an aspiring author myself working on a manuscript, and I relate to everything you're talking about. Tell me, social media, how do you juggle this with being an author? I'm hearing it's a requirement now, which isn't easy for literary people.
And being an introvert makes it even harder.
Yeah, there are authors who share everything and are very, they'll show them crying because they got a nasty criticism on Goodreads or something. And I'm not that way, but I love sharing the research and the inspiration. And so it's a matter of taking your time. Like if I'm not publishing a book, I'll